Hey everyone, thanks for joining. This is Matt Gayer, Co-Executive Director at the Catalog for Philanthropy. Talking about organizational values today. We're just going to give folks another minute here to hop on. Just one more minute, then we'll get started. Thank you. All right, we're going to go and get started. For those of y'all that just hopped on, my name is Matt Gayer, Co-Executive Director at the Catalog for Philanthropy. Excited to talk to you all today about setting organizational values. Couple of things to note before we begin. You should be able to see our screen right now, hear our audio. If you have challenges with either today, just let us know. We'll try to address those as quickly as we can. If you have any questions throughout, feel free to ask those in the question box. We'll answer those as they come up or at the end of the webinar today. And we will send out a copy of the slides and recording shortly afterwards. So you will receive a copy of the slides and recording shortly after the webinar, along with a very short, less than a minute evaluation. We really appreciate you taking the time to complete that as well. So we're going to go ahead and dive on in to thinking about organizational values and why we kind of talk about this topic, why we think it's so important, as it really is something that can help us stand out. So we'll go through 5 specific tips, and I apologize for the construction noise in the background if you all are able to hear that. But we'll go through 5 specific tips today about how to set your values and kind of what to think about when you're value setting for your organizations. But a couple of things for context before we begin. Values, this is an evergreen topic, right? So it is a little more important right now. We'll talk about why it's so important right now. This is something that's always important for an organization. It should help guide our decision making, the behaviors we promote, the culture on the team, and it can really be a powerful both internal and external force for the organization. So something that's a best practice for organizations to kind of focus on. Secondly, in addition to it always being a good idea, it's especially a good idea right now. A lot of organizations are thinking about the why behind their work right now, right? Why do we do the work we do? How do we do it? How do we relate to the community? What do we prioritize? And thinking about that conversation often leads us to values, right? So we really want to have an equitable and just approach to our work and kind of embed that in our work. Values are going to be a really important thing for us to think through and identify. And then funders and donors are looking for this more than before. So this may not always been something that they prioritize in the past, but increasingly folks are looking at intent. They're looking at the way you do your work, right? The way you relate to the ecosystem that you're in, and values can signal that in a really easy, concrete way for folks. So really important to think about there. And then finally, we know our teams are tired, our teams have a lot on their plates, and this value conversation can really be an engaging one for staff. And hopefully get them really excited. So especially if you have a team that, coming out of the last couple of years is feeling it, right, is feeling tired, a little burnt out, this can be hopefully something that re-engages them and really gets them fired up. And we hear for a lot of organizations, they have a mix of new staff and staff that have been there for a long time. So this can also be a unifying thing to do. So really great to tackle 2 of the common challenges we hear around team engagement right now. So the first tip we'll go over is think about how values relate to the other kind of strategic, statements or phrases, right, that exist for the organization. We get this question a lot of, why do I do values if I already have a mission and vision? So we'll talk about how those 3 should be a little different and why values are a unique opportunity. So mission and vision, you definitely should have, right? And they should be as strong as they possibly can. A vision is really a high level reasoning behind the work. It's a lofty goal that's still kind of directly tied to our efforts, right? We're trying to create a equitable and just community. We're trying to create equal opportunity for quality education for students, right? Whatever it might be, it's something kind of big picture. We may never get there, but we're working towards it, right? Usually a shorter phrase than your mission and pretty straightforward. So a vision can be great. It's an easy way for folks to kind of understand kind of what you're about, right, and kind of where you're headed. Mission kind of goes hand in hand with that vision and outlines more kind of what you do, right? So it should be really clear. People should get a high level sense of your work as it relates to your mission and have a little bit of an ability to read your mission and be like, okay, that's the type of work they do, right? Is really how people should feel about that. And both of these incredibly important and also a good activity to do with staff and board to get folks aligned around them. But why values kind of stand out as a unique opportunity right now is that ultimately a lot of missions and visions end up sounding pretty similar, right? So as strong as they are, and you definitely should invest time in them 100%, they often sound a little repetitive, right? Or there's only so many out there, right? Your individual words might be different, but the actual mission and vision for most organizations, not all, some are incredibly unique and the mission and vision really stand out. Most of the time, the mission and vision, you've heard something like it before, right? And in a crowded space with a lot of folks kind of doing great work, they can kind of get lost in the ether a little bit there. Values, though, can really stand out. So often it's the forgotten piece of strategic items. Out of these three, it's the one that's done the least often, and that folks kind of prioritize last often. It really guides how the work is done and what work gets prioritized, right? So values, if you actually use them after you make them, can really probably impact the day-to-day work a bit more than a mission and vision can. It's often going to be also something that's going to stand out a bit more because you can get a little more creative and a little bit unique with it. So when we think about the values we could choose for the organization, right? And we'll talk about the process and getting feedback on these here in a minute, but just when we think about the universe of values that we might end up picking, that our teams, our groups, our organizations might end up prioritizing and kind of claiming as ours, there's a few different buckets of values to kind of choose from. So some of the first kind of bucket of values you might be thinking about is values related to kind of the process, right? So how you kind of do the work. So things like collaboration, right? You approach your work internally and externally from a collaborative mindset, looking for partners, right? It could be relational, could be creative, resilient. Any of these values that have to do with kind of how we do the work we do. The focus here is really on how the work is done, how your team engages with others, right, and how you want to be kind of thought of as a partner. So these values can be really helpful because it sets apart how you do the work, right? So you might have 5 different after-school programs that are all kind of the mission and vision are probably relatively similar, but you think you do your work in a more collaborative or creative way, right? Claiming that as a value can help kind of show that and highlight that to donors and others. It also allows for new people joining your team when they see that, when they see collaboration as a value, for instance, encourages them to live that out a bit, right? So it's also self-fulfilling that as we claim these values, especially on the process ones, it impacts how our teams are doing the work that they do. The second bucket to consider is really values kind of related to the community, right? It comes from kind of a community mindset. So things like equity, justice, continual learning, continual improvement, adaptability. For some of our education organizations, youth-led, right? Community-focused, whatever that might be. The focus is really on how you place yourself in the community that you're in. So it focuses on that natural relationship between the community, the ecosystem, and the organization. These values are really important to let people know kind of how you view yourself. It's often going to guide the work we choose to do, right? So if we're, if equity is one of our core values that we're centering at the organization, there's going to be probably opportunities for funding, for projects, et cetera, that we may or may not take because of that value that we're espousing, right? And that value that we're committing to. If we're youth-led, that's obviously going to shift how we run our programs, right? How our programs are kind of chosen. So anything about client interactions, things like that, all get back to this kind of community bucket of values. And then finally, the last bucket of values to consider here are values kind of around your attitude. So it's kind of how you think about or approach the work, right? So the other two are really about, the work itself in some ways, right? How you do the work. how you do the work in relation to the community around you, attitudes, what energy you're bringing to the work. A lot of times is going to probably most impact and focus on how staff relate to the work, right? Or the feelings we want to create for clients, right? So what's the customer experience and or staff experience? That's often going to fall in this attitude values bucket. So these are things like joy, right? We want our staff and clients to feel joy when they're doing our programming. Energetic, passionate, committed, right? Any of those words that kind of relate to, again, how individuals either experience the organization through the eyes of staff or clients. When you're choosing values, we're not going to stick to any one of these buckets. We probably should be pulling a couple of values from each. So there should be at least one value from each of these buckets when you pick your list of kind of 4 to 6 values. And that's typically what we see in that 4 to 6 realm. So picking at least one from each and possibly kind of 2 or 3. Next, we'll talk about kind of, okay, so I have this idea, right, of, we want joy to be one of our values, equity, collaboration, et cetera. Kind of how do I actually operationalize that, right? What do I actually write? Do I just write joy? Like, what does that look like? So typically, a value is a phrase, right? So we see it doesn't have to be, it could be just the one word, but the real trend in the space is that it's usually a 2-word phrase that you're using there. So you could definitely pick a single word if you think that's more powerful. Whichever I would do across all, right? So if you have 5 values, either all 5 single words or all 5 phrases. So they should kind of build on each other there. But often the examples here are, for instance, just equity. It's like building equity, creating joy, authentic collaboration, whatever that might be. But using an adjective or verb to make that value feel a little more real and a little bit more active, right? So it's not just equity, it's building equity, right? It's not just joy, it's creating joy, right? So now that value doesn't just feel kind of esoteric, it feels like, oh, every day this organization is creating X, Y, or Z thing, right? Is building X, Y, or Z thing, is centering X, Y, or Z thing. So it helps people feel a little bit more like you're actually kind of doing it actively and not just kind of saying it once. From the phrase, we often, that'll be kind of our core values, but then we have a kind of 1-sentence description that often goes along with them. And this can be important because especially if we choose a value or phrase, word that people may not relate to directly or has a lot of different meanings, right? Or it's just kind of a word that's used a lot these days, right? Collaboration, equity, both good examples of this. A lot of people are saying those words. So the 1-sentence description can really help explain to people what it means to you when you say collaboration, right? What it means to you when you say equity. So often, there's a quick example here about collaboration, right? Authentic collaboration, celebrating each other's wins and looking for opportunities to learn from each other, right? Not saying that that's a great sentence there, just kind of a quick example of kind of what we're talking about, but something quick to show people a little bit what you mean when you kind of say that, right? Or how that kind of shows up for you. We want to use this to kind of make that value clearer, and again, add our own kind of lens and spin to it. And then finally, we want to make sure these values aren't just buried somewhere on like the 10th page of our website, right? So we want these to be clear on the About page right next to mission vision. And also, once we adopt these, making sure we let stakeholders know, right? So the board should be involved in this process anyway. We'll talk about that in a second. The board, staff, volunteers, donors, and then also obviously sharing on social. We really want to make sure we announce this and use this as an opportunity to let people know, hey, we have values, and here's what they are, right? And hopefully get people excited by them. Fourth tip here is around how to make sure these values are not just things you write once, but actually things that impact the organization and impact how you do your work. So this is where kind of values kind of hit real life, right? So one thing we want to do here and kind of think about is mapping out our values against our work. So if we're thinking about this in an Excel spreadsheet or a grid that we're making, the major projects we have, right, our big fundraising event, our core programs, etc. We're going to write out as the different rows. And then the different columns going across are the values we just committed. right? And we want to have a conversation with our team about, if collaboration is one of our values, how in each of these projects is collaboration showing up? And if collaboration isn't showing up somewhere right now, what do we need to do differently to make sure that value uh, is expressed and kind of inherent in that work that we're doing there? So we really want to make sure that across our different projects, even something like a fundraising event, we may often not think about our values showing up in the type of operational activity, right? Maybe we're thinking about our values in our programming already, but we're often not thinking about it in the admin, the fundraising, the ops world. But really important that we make sure that that's consistent there, right? So across our events, across our administrative work, across our programming work, these values are showing up in every bucket. If we find areas of work that don't align with the values, we want to change it, right? So we want to encourage staff to really be honest during this conversation. This is a great engagement activity for the team. Uh, Asking them about kind of, hey, where do you see this value not showing up, right? What are the pain points right now for you around collaborating when it comes to our programmatic work, when it comes to our admin work, and figuring out kind of why that's happening, right? Often we see the values not being lived out, not because people aren't committed to them or people are actively choosing to go against them in some work, but usually it's because that's how it's always been done, right? That's how we often hear a reason why maybe a value isn't showing up in some work. It could be that we don't feel like we have the time, right? We don't feel like we have the resources. So sometimes we have to make space, right? Because some of these values might require us to do the work a little slower. So making sure those values show up is really important, and having that conversation can surface some challenges to doing so. And then finally, we want to kind of check in with staff regularly about this moving forward. So we'll do this as kind of one activity, right? Get this map for our major workflows. Then maybe 6 months later, a year later, we want to make sure we're still checking in on this every 6 to 12 months, saying like, hey, I want to revisit our values and make sure that this still feels like these are showing up in this project, right, in this workflow. And our final tip today is about how to really embed these in the organization. Before we get to this, someone was just asking kind of who should be involved in setting the values. That's a great question. So it should be hopefully, at least initially, a staff conversation, right? Surfacing some of these. Depending on kind of the relationship between staff and board, we could do that with the whole staff and board at a retreat. Often we see organizations choose to kind of start this with the staff. The staff are the ones doing the work every day. Take it back from staff, refine and wordsmith it a little bit, take it to the board and walk them through, get any feedback, then kind of make a final decision. We can kind of vote on this at the board level and kind of get it formally approved for the organization. That's a great way to kind of show you're really committed to it. And that's usually the way to kind of help make them stick the most. All right. The final tip here on embedding the values, how to make these really last, right? One thing we can do is actually tie them to staff performance. So put them into the performance review. Often our performance reviews are just looking at, right, like, did you hit the goals that you set out? So this is going to help us actually go beyond just that and also talk about how staff are getting the work done, right? So we obviously, this is a long-term thing to implement because we want to let staff know, as soon as we adopt the new values about it ahead of time, right? And give them at least 6 months to kind of factor that into their work before they're getting reviewed on it. So this isn't something we'd put in place tomorrow. But this is something that, we can have a value section at the beginning of the review, have them mark how they feel like they've been living up to those values. You can mark it and then have a conversation about where there's gaps. We want to make sure, though, that we are clear with them kind of what we mean by those different values, right, and give them some examples there. So what we don't want is those values just to be something we evaluate them kind of arbitrarily against. So we do want to make sure that there's still the kind of concrete part of the review. And also, even for those value pieces, we're kind of defining and explaining that a bit. For the board, we want to make sure the board's aware of those values, right? We want to include them in the kind of the rollout. We want to, again, kind of tie the values into our review of both the ED and the board. So just like we're using it to review staff, we're also using it to review the board and the executive director. And then finally, this shouldn't be a one-time conversation. Right? Organizations shift, climates shift, ecosystems shift, and as that happens, as we live into these values, we may want or need different values a couple of years from now. right? So 2 or 3 years later, these values might be still 100% what we're committed to. We probably still are supportive of them. There might be new language we want to adopt, right? Maybe we have a lot of staff turnover and the new team thinks about the work differently, right? We have a new leader in place. So we want these values to be long lasting, to exist for at least a few years at a time. We definitely don't want to be changing them constantly. It'd be great to kind of get kind of a 3 to 6 years out of them in many cases, but at least revisiting them to make sure the team's still committed to them, make sure it still feels relevant to the work, make sure that they're still excited by it. So with that, I'll go over some quick next steps, then pause. I see a few questions already, but if you have any questions, feel free to ask. So a couple of things to do now as you're kind of prepping for this. The first thing to do is just schedule a conversation about your values, right? So if you already have them, but haven't talked about them in a while, it's a great thing to kind of revisit. If you don't have them, it's a great thing to start. You're going to want to plan a retreat, right? So have some time with staff and then a review by the board to talk about those values and talk about kind of what they maybe should be. We want to, after we adopt them, map those to our major work to see how they overlap. And then, as you're doing this process, you can also look at what others are doing in the space. You definitely shouldn't feel committed to choosing any values just because you feel like you have to because others did. You can often get some good inspiration, especially around language, right? By looking at what other values people have committed to. We're going to bake this into the performance reviews of staff, ED, and the board. So this is something people are prioritizing. And then finally getting kind of continual feedback and evaluation from the team about the values over time. So that, I'll pause here for questions. Someone asked, how many values should we have? So I mentioned this earlier. There's no set number. I think the minimum we usually see organizations adopt is around 4, and I think the max is usually 6, occasionally 7. That really gets to be a lot, right? If you're really thinking about living these authentically and centering these at the organization, 7's a lot of things to think about. So often that 4 to 6, 4 to 5 range is really where we see people land. Someone else was asking, do foundations really look at these? I think increasingly so. Again, it's not going to be the core reason they fund you or not, but it can help you stand out. So if you have 2 different programs that do somewhat similar work, at least on the surface, values are one way a foundation, right, might get a sense of kind of how you'll be as a grantee and a partner, right? And often foundations, right, are thinking about the same issue in very different ways depending on their own values. So those values can really help you rise above there if they're looking at a couple different folks. Someone else, is there any risk in turning people off of the organization by stating values? Generally no, because the values we're picking are probably universally accepted as things that are pretty good. But I'll say that, if you are kind of picking a value that maybe someone else doesn't have or doesn't prioritize, there's going to be more people that get more excited by your work than there will be people who leave because of it. So if you lost 1 or 2 folks, I think that'll be made up for by the excitement from kind of your core supporters. Will probably be excited to see kind of the why you do your work. Any other questions folks have before I wrap up today? All right, great. Well, we'll set up the slides and recording shortly afterwards, and thank you all for joining.